The most terrifying sound in the world is not an explosion. It is silence. Total, absolute, industrial silence. Let me take you to the island of Kyushu, Japan. They call this place the Silicon Island. Usually, the hum of the Renesas electronics factory is a constant vibration in the ground. It is the heartbeat of the Japanese economy. It is the sound of billions of dollars in semiconductors being born every single hour. But today, standing outside the gates, you hear nothing. The machinery has stopped. The assembly lines are frozen. The workers have been sent home. Inside the facility, the clean rooms are dark. The warning lights on the control panels are all flashing red. Material shortage. Critical supply failure. System shutdown. This is not a maintenance break. This is not a holiday. This is a cardiac arrest of the third largest economy on the planet. 3 months ago, Japan made a choice. They seized a Taiwanese ship carrying silver to Shanghai. They thought it was a power move. They thought they were choking China's manufacturing sector. They thought they had the upper hand because they had the U.S. Navy behind them. But they forgot one thing. They forgot that while they control the oceans, China controls the chemistry. They didn't realize that their entire high-tech existence hung by a thread made of elements most people cannot even pronounce. Gallium, Germanium, Graphite. Japan fired a warning shot across the bow of a ship. China didn't fire back. China didn't launch a missile. China didn't send a destroyer. China simply opened a drawer in Beijing, took out a piece of paper, and signed it. And just like that, the lights went out in Tokyo. This is not a story about trade tariffs. This is not a story about diplomatic sanctions. This is the story of Option Zero. The moment the world realized that in a trade war, the nation with the raw materials always holds the ultimate trump card. Let me show you how Japan's economy was murdered in 90 days without a single drop of blood being spilled. The trigger MOFCOM Notice 12/2026. It started on a Tuesday morning, April 14, 2026, 10 a.m., Beijing time. The Japanese government was feeling confident. The silver blockade was holding. The U.S. State Department had just issued a statement praising Japan's commitment to regional security. The Tokyo Stock Exchange was trading at an all-time high. Hubris was in the air. And then, the website of China's Ministry of Commerce, MOFCOM, updated. It was a simple press release. Notice number 12/2026. It looked boring. It looked bureaucratic. But to the intelligence analysts watching the feed, it looked like a declaration of war. The notice stated that effective immediately, the export of gallium, germanium, and natural graphite would require a specific dual-use license. It wasn't a ban. That is the genius of the strategy. If they called it a ban, Japan could take them to the World Trade Organization. If they called it a ban, the world would unite against them immediately. So they didn't call it a ban. They called it National Security Export Control. They used the exact same language Japan used to seize the silver. They copied the Japanese law word for word. They said these materials had potential military applications. They said China needed to ensure these critical elements didn't fall into the wrong hands. And just like that, the trap snapped shut. By noon, the trading desks at Mitsubishi Corporation and Mitsui were in chaos. These are the Sogo Shosha, the massive trading houses that fuel Japan's industry. They started calling their suppliers in China. They called the mines in Inner Mongolia. They called the refineries in Guangdong. Usually, these calls are answered in seconds. Usually, the deals are signed in minutes. But today, nobody was picking up. When they finally got through to a manager at a gallium refinery, the answer was polite, terrifyingly polite. The Chinese supplier said, "We have your order. The material is ready. We want to ship it, but we are waiting for the government license. It is just paperwork. Please be patient. Please be patient." That was the weapon. The Japanese traders asked, "How long will the license take?" The answer was, "We do not know. Maybe a week, maybe a month." The review process is very thorough. In logistics, "we do not know" means death. Japan's entire manufacturing model is built on just-in-time. They don't keep warehouses full of inventory. They rely on a steady, rhythmic flow of materials arriving exactly when needed. Toyota doesn't store 6 months of parts. They store 6 hours of parts. China knew this. They knew they didn't have to destroy the material. They just had to delay it. They just had to introduce friction into a frictionless system. Within 48 hours, the panic reached the cabinet level in Tokyo. The Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry held an emergency press conference. He tried to look calm. He said, "We are aware of the new administrative procedures. We are engaging in dialogue with our Chinese counterparts. We have strategic reserves." He was lying. And the market knew he was lying, because everyone in the industry knows the dirty secret of Japan's strategic reserves. Japan has reserves of ore. They have reserves of raw rock. But they do not have the domestic capacity to refine it at scale. You cannot feed a raw rock into a semiconductor machine. You need 99.9999% pure metal. And the only country that makes that metal at that scale, at that price, is the one that just stopped answering the phone. The trigger had been pulled. The bullet was in the air. And Japan was standing directly in its path. The mechanism, the periodic table weapon. To understand why this killed the economy so fast, you have to understand the chemistry. You have to look at the periodic table not as a science chart, but as a weapons catalog. Let's start with gallium, atomic number 31. It is a soft, silvery metal that melts in your hand. It seems harmless. But gallium is the blood of modern electronics. You cannot make a modern radar system without gallium. You cannot make a 5G base station without gallium. You cannot make the LEDs that light up our screens without gallium. And most importantly, you cannot make the power management chips that control an electric vehicle without gallium. For decades, the world let China produce it. Why? Because producing gallium is dirty, energy-intensive, and expensive. It is a byproduct of aluminum processing. Western nations didn't want the pollution. They didn't want the low margins, so they outsourced it. They let China corner the market. Before the ban, China produced 98% of the world's primary gallium. 98%. That is not a market share. That is a monopoly. That is a chokehold. When that supply stops, there is no plan B. You cannot just open a mine in Australia tomorrow. Building a refinery takes 5 years. Japan had 5 days. Now, look at graphite. This is the killer blow for the auto industry. Graphite is the anode of a lithium-ion battery. Every single electric car battery is roughly 25% graphite by weight. It is the largest component in the battery. And here is the technical detail that the politicians missed. You can mine graphite in many places. You can find it in Africa. You can find it in Brazil. But you cannot put mined graphite into a battery. It has to be processed. It has to be purified and shaped into microscopic spheres. This process is called spheroidization. It is difficult. It involves harsh acids. And China controls over 90% of the world's capacity for refining battery-grade graphite. This was the trap. Japan thought they had diversified. Toyota and Panasonic had signed contracts with mines in Mozambique. They thought they were safe. But where did that Mozambique ore go for processing? It went to China. It all went to China. The supply chain was a circle, and all roads led to Beijing. So when MOFCOM issued Notice 12, they didn't just cut off Chinese graphite. They cut off the processing capacity for the whole world. The Japanese automakers were staring at piles of useless raw ore that they couldn't refine. It was like having a barrel of crude oil, but no gasoline for your car. You are still walking. The mechanism of this war was precise. It was surgical. China didn't cut off everything. They kept shipping cheap plastic toys. They kept shipping clothes. They kept shipping furniture. They only cut off the specific, tiny ingredients that made high-value manufacturing possible. It is like baking a cake. If you don't have flour, you can't bake. But if you have flour, sugar, eggs, and milk, but you don't have baking powder, you still don't have a cake. You just have a mess. Gallium and germanium are the baking powder of the global economy. They are small by volume, but critical by function. And by controlling the bottleneck, China controlled the entire bottle. The price of gallium on the black market exploded. Before the ban, it was around $300 a kilogram. 2 weeks later, smugglers in Vietnam were selling it for $10,000 a kilogram. But even at that price, you couldn't get enough. A factory like Renesas needs tons, not kilograms. You cannot run a gigafactory on smuggled suitcases. The mechanism worked perfectly. The starvation began. The collapse, industrial cardiac arrest. By week 4, the cracks turned into canyons. The first domino to fall was the pride of Japan, Toyota, the largest automaker in the world. The symbol of Japanese industrial might. On May 5th, Toyota issued a press release that shook the Tokyo Stock Exchange. They announced the immediate suspension of the BZ4X production line. They announced a 60% cut in production for all hybrid models. The reason? Supply chain irregularities regarding power semiconductors and battery anodes. That was the corporate speak. The reality was that they had run out of chips. A modern car has thousands of chips. If you are missing one, you cannot ship the car. You cannot sell a car that is 99% complete. It sits in a parking lot, gathering dust. And that is exactly what happened. The port of Nagoya, usually the busiest car export hub in the world, turned into a parking lot of unfinished vehicles. Thousands of cars, sitting there, waiting for a $10 chip that contains a gram of gallium. Toyota's stock plunged 12% in a single session. Billions of dollars in market value evaporated before lunch. Then came the electronics giants, Sony, Canon, Nikon. They rely on germanium for high-end optical sensors and lenses. Germanium is transparent to infrared light. It is essential for night vision, for fiber optics, for advanced sensors. Sony had to tell Apple that they could not guarantee the delivery of image sensors for the next iPhone. The shockwave went from Tokyo to Cupertino instantly. Apple shares dipped. The panic went global. But the real pain was happening on the ground in the cities of Japan. Let's go to Osaka. Let's look at a man named Kenji. Kenji is a structural engineer at a Tier 2 supplier for Honda. His company makes the control units for the braking system. He has worked there for 20 years. He has a mortgage. He has 2 kids in university. On Friday afternoon, his boss called everyone into the cafeteria. The boss was crying. He bowed deeply, his head almost touching the floor. He said, "I am sorry. We have no materials. We cannot work. Starting Monday, the factory is closed until further notice. You will receive 60% of your base pay. Please forgive me." Kenji walked out of that factory into a world that was rapidly becoming too expensive to live in. Because the ban didn't just stop production, it killed the currency. Foreign investors looked at Japan. They saw an economy with no resources, fighting a trade war with its biggest supplier. They saw a losing bet. They sold the yen. They sold it hard. The yen crashed to 170 against the dollar. Import costs skyrocketed. Energy costs soared. Food prices climbed. In the electronics district of Akihabara, prices for computer parts tripled overnight. A graphics card became a luxury item. A laptop became an investment. People started hoarding electronics, not because they needed them, but because they knew they wouldn't be able to afford them next month. Inflation hit levels not seen since the post-war era. The Japanese public was angry. They took to the streets in Shinjuku. But they weren't protesting against China. They were protesting against their own government. They were shouting, "Why did you provoke them? Why did you seize the silver? Why did you start a war we cannot win?" The government had no answer. They had gambled on American support, but America couldn't print gallium. America couldn't print graphite. Japan was alone in the cold, and the winter was just beginning. The global ripple, the boomerang effect. Then, the boomerang hit the West. Washington had pushed Japan to take the hard line. The Pentagon had wargamed this scenario. But their war games were focused on missiles and ships. They forgot to wargame the supply chain of their own defense industry. It turns out the U.S. military has a problem. The F-35 Lightning II, the most advanced fighter jet in history, the backbone of NATO air superiority. Its radar, the AN/APG-85, is a marvel of engineering. It uses gallium nitride, or GaN technology. This allows the radar to see further, jam better, and survive longer. Who makes the high-grade GaN modules for the radar? A specialized contractor in the United States. But where does that contractor get the precursor substrate? Japan. And where does Japan get the raw gallium? China. The chain snapped. 3 weeks into the ban, Lockheed Martin quietly notified the Pentagon that radar deliveries were at risk. The production of the F-35 slowed down. United States, the greatest military power on Earth, found its production lines hostage to a mining permit in Beijing. It was a humiliation. It exposed the failure of friendshoring. For years, politicians said, "We don't need China. We will trade with our friends. We will trade with Japan, with Korea, with Europe." But they missed the point. Your friends are addicted to China too. You can move the final assembly to Japan. You can move the factory to Vietnam. You can move the headquarters to Ireland. But if the dirt comes from China, you haven't decoupled. You have just hidden the dependency. Europe felt it too. The European Union had a grand plan. The Green Deal, carbon neutral by 2050. Wind turbines everywhere. Solar panels on every roof. Electric cars in every driveway. But solar panels need gallium. Wind turbines need rare earth magnets. Electric cars need graphite. China controls the supply of all three. The price of a solar panel in Germany jumped 40%. European solar installers went bankrupt. The Green Deal hit a brick wall. Europe realized that its environmental salvation was entirely dependent on Chinese industrial goodwill. The G7 leaders called an emergency summit. They issued strong statements. They threatened consequences. But behind closed doors, the mood was funeral. They realized they had built a global economy on a foundation of sand. And China just kicked the sand away. Japan was the first victim. But the message was for everyone. You can put your aircraft carriers in our waters. But we can put your industries in the dark. The global ripple turned into a tsunami. Investors fled tech stocks. The Nasdaq wobbled. The illusion of Western industrial independence was shattered. De-risking had failed, because you cannot de-risk physics. You cannot de-risk geology. The minerals are where they are. And they are not in our backyard. The year 2027. By early 2027, the landscape of global power had shifted. Japan eventually negotiated. They had to. The silver seizure was quietly reversed. The cargo was returned. Compensation was paid behind closed doors. China resumed exports, but the damage was done. Japanese companies began moving their factories out of Japan and into China. Not for cheap labor, but for access to materials. If you are inside China, you get the gallium. If you are outside, you get the waiting list. It was the ultimate irony. The trade war designed to isolate China ended up forcing Japanese industry to integrate even deeper into China just to survive. The era of just-in-time is dead. We have entered the era of just-in-case. Every nation is now scrambling to build stockpiles. Every nation is trying to open mines, but mines take 10 years to open. Blockades take 10 minutes to announce. The gap between those two timelines is where the danger lies. We spent the 20th century fighting over oil. We burned the world for black gold. We are spending the 21st century fighting over the periodic table. We will burn economies for gray powder. The silver shipment was just the opening move. The rare earth ban was the countermove. But the game is not over. Because while we are watching the factories close in Japan, another choke point is being tightened. Another vein is being targeted. Japan survived, barely. But what happens when the target isn't an island nation? What happens when the target is the United States? And what happens when the weapon isn't a metal, but a waterway? You think the rare earth ban was devastating? Wait until you see what happens when China decides to close the Malacca Strait. Wait until you see what happens when the oil stops flowing to Taiwan and Korea. That is not a trade war. That is an energy strangulation. And the U.S. Navy creates a blockade plan, but China has a counter-blockade plan. I will break down that nightmare scenario in the next video. If your country's industry relied on a single enemy for survival, would you choose immediate collapse or total submission? Because that is the choice Japan faced. And that is the choice we are all going to face very